The Land Rover is probably one of the greatest British automotive successes, used not just here in the UK but also all around the world, and not just in civilian use but also in military service. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the Land Rover Series 1 Pick-up from Airfix. For a deeper dive inside the contents of the box, where I take a look at the plastic parts, decals and instructions, check out the dedicated unboxing video I've already made on that topic. In this video I'll be focusing on what this kit is like to build. In actual fact I'll be splitting this video into two kind of parts. The first part I'll be completing the build in its most simple manner, and then in the second part of this video I will be completing the build with a diorama and some figures. As usual, I'll put a list of the products I used during this build on the screen now to give you an idea of the kind of things you might want to go and get if you fancy building one of these for yourself. As this kit is specially designed as an easy to build starter set, it comes with a selection of paint, a brush and some glue. However, in my particular example, the paint is less than perfect. This is a problem that we have experienced with other Airfix starter sets in the past, with the included Humbrol paints drying out. This is due to a fault in the pot design which causes an air gap and allows the paint to solidify. I will try my best to revive these paints as best I can and use them here and there, but I may have to opt for some substitutes in places. The only paint that is technically completely usable is this light grey colour, as it comes in a different style of pot. The other three all being contained within the more defective version. But with that complaint out of the way, let's get on with the build. My first step is to start removing the parts that I need from the sprue using my cutters. There isn't anything really in the way of flash on this kit, as it is a pretty recent tooling, but there are some extra mould pips that will need to be cut away. Any rough plastic left over from this can be carefully sanded down with a sanding stick. I'm not going to bother using the included cement, instead opting to use Tamiya Extra Thin. The first step was to join the backrests onto the rear wall of the cab. This could then be added onto the main chassis. There are some clear parts included, and there is one here which can be added. A small amount of Tamiya Extra Thin was run into the seams, which should bond it in place. The seats were then glued into place on the main chassis, and this was followed by the installation of a clear part on the front windscreen. There are also some clear parts for the doors, and these were glued from the inside of this part. Because I think it might be easier to paint these parts with the clear parts masked, I decided to appropriately mask them. I used a variety of different tapes, cut to size, and pressed into the clear parts. Any excess tape could be carefully cut away with a sharp knife. I would make sure to mask both the inside and the outside of these parts. Which means with that done, now it's time to prime. I decided to use this Humbrol No. 1 grey primer. It should give a nice even coat, providing a surface for subsequent layers of paint to stick to. First up, I'm going to try that light grey that is included in the starter set, but I will thin it down with a little acrylic thinner. I painted a number of thin coats of this colour onto the inside surfaces of the vehicle. As you can probably see though, the colour isn't particularly consistent. It's a bit blotchy, and I'm not really enjoying using this paint. Also, I'm not entirely happy with the colour. From a bit of research I did online, it seems like it should be more of a dove grey colour, and this is like a light grey, almost like a sand. So with that, I decided to fix this problem by mixing up some RLM75 and some white. This should give a slightly more purpley kind of grey, which might be more appropriate to a dove grey. Remember this because I will use this colour again later on for the external surfaces of the vehicle as well. With that paint mixed up, it would be painted over the top of all of the light grey from earlier. I'm not too worried about neatness on the internal surfaces. It will be much more important on the external surfaces later on. Vallejo Black was used to paint the steering wheel. And when that was dry, it could be added onto the windscreen component part. The included blue colour will be used for the seats. I have tried to rescue this with some acrylic thinner, but the opacity on this one wasn't particularly great. It did take a number of coats in order to build up a nice solid colour, but I'm not really enjoying these starter set paints. There are a couple of decals which need to go inside of the vehicle, so some Humbrol decal fix was used to soften them and release them from the backing paper. Just a small amount on the paper should soak in and help them release. You can use water, but I thought this would just be a bit quicker. And a little more targeted so I don't have to cut the sheet. With some additional decal fix applied to the component, these dials could then be added into their respective places. With that done and they've been allowed to cure, some matte varnish was painted over the top to help seal them in and protect them from the next step. The next step is to use some black wash. This is a Vallejo Game Wash, and I actually added a few extra drops of water to make it flow a little better. This was painted over all of the internal surfaces to help add a layer of contrast and shade. It should help to bring out some of the details. With that done, I carefully removed my homemade masks from the inside surfaces only. I'll leave the external masks on for now, as I still have to paint the outside of the vehicle after I've built it. Now I can begin work on some external elements of the vehicle. The clear front light parts were glued into the back of the radiator grille, and then some Vallejo aluminium paint was painted on the inside surfaces. Some Vallejo liquid mask would be applied to the outside surfaces to protect them when I come to paint this a bit later on. Now I built up the main bonnet assembly and joined the front part of the vehicle onto it. This could be then joined onto the windscreen component and then installed onto the main chassis. The sides of the body of the vehicle can be added. It was a little bit fiddly just to get things lined up correctly, and the rear wall of the cab did have to be kind of bent inwards a little bit just to get it to align. So with a little bit of force, I could carefully get this all aligned reasonably neatly, but this is something to watch out for. The alignment here is ever so slightly off, but it can be fixed with a bit of persuasion. The roof was then added onto the top of the vehicle, and then I flipped it over to work on the chassis. The chassis has a surprising number of parts, but it does build up relatively easily. I added the various suspension springs and then moved on to the axles. These come in a number of parts as well, and when joined together could then be glued onto the model. The last part to add on here is a small kind of support brace, which runs across the width of the main chassis frame. There is quite a nice level of detail on the underside of this vehicle. Now I can join the wheels together. The wheels come in two halves and it is relatively simple just to join them together. You do get 5 wheels included. 4 for the vehicle and 1 as a spare, so do make sure you know which one is the spare as it has a slightly different design. And now it's time to prime. Again, I'm using the exact same primer as I used earlier, and this would be sprayed onto the entire vehicle as well as the tyres and wheels, which are yet to be added. You'll remember from earlier that I mixed up a RLM 75 and a little bit of white to make a more appropriate dove grey, and I mixed in some clear gloss varnish into this to give it a slightly more satin sheen. This was then hand painted over the entire bodywork of the vehicle. I actually only needed a couple of thin coats to get a nice uniform coverage of this paint. For the hubs of the wheels, I used the included 96 REF blue. Whilst it went onto the hubs of the wheels relatively nicely, I did start to struggle when I was applying it onto the chassis underframe. Over these larger surfaces, the opacity is not great. Also, I am struggling a little bit to get it into all those nooks and crannies. I would have preferred to have done most of this model build in a kind of back to basics way where you hand paint everything, but at this point I was starting to get a bit annoyed with this colour. As we mentioned earlier, the starter set paints aren't fantastic, so what I decided to do was to thin it down a little more and put it through my airbrush. I masked off the sides of the vehicle to protect them from any overspray, and then a number of thin coats of this blue would be applied through the airbrush. I was actually surprised that I could get it to flow through the airbrush quite well. But still, it's not fantastic, it's not a great paint, and I would definitely be looking for a different version if I were to build this vehicle again. With that done, I carefully hand painted Vallejo black onto the tyres of the wheels, and then this aluminium paint would be used to pick out all of the trim. I started on the bumper of the vehicle, then moved on to all the metalwork which frames the various panels. I did this carefully using the edge of a fine brush to try and avoid getting it anywhere it shouldn't go. This was a little bit fiddly, but I think it does help to lift the look of the vehicle. And now I'm going to move on to the decals. There are only a couple of decals left, so the entire sheet was soaked in warm water. And if you'd like to get your hands on a brushwater mug, check out my merch store. Once these decals have been left to soak and have separated from the backing paper, a little more Humbrol decal fix was painted onto the relevant places they were going to go. This should help soften them a little more and stick onto the surface of the plastic. And as there's only a few decals to apply at this point, this was a reasonably quick step. With that done, this gloss red would be used to carefully pick out the tail lights at the rear of the vehicle. And now, with all of that done, some Humbrol clear matte varnish would be used to clear coat the entire vehicle. Whilst this is a matte varnish, it isn't quite as matte as other brands that I've used, and it has an ever so slight satin sheen to it. But I think that it will look quite good as the finishing coat for this vehicle. This matte varnish should help seal in those transfers that I've applied and prevent them from peeling. With that done, some of the black wash that I used earlier would again be thinned down with a little water and then painted over the entire vehicle. This is just going to help bring out all those recessed details and add a further layer of contrast to the vehicle. The wheels were then carefully glued onto the axles, and it is worth noting that unlike some previous offerings in the Airfix range, there is no play value in this kit, so these wheels are glued solid. I had to make sure, of course, to not forget to add the spare wheel onto the bonnet. With that done, I carefully removed the masks on the clear parts of the vehicle, not forgetting to peel away the liquid mask from the headlights. There are some windscreen wipers which need to be picked out, so again some aluminium was used to do this. And with that, the first part of this video is now complete. Here is the Land Rover in its kind of most basic form. This is probably a standard that most people would be looking to achieve in a kind of out-of-the-box kind of build. I've only done a couple of extra bits and pieces to this, such as applying that wash and painting the rear of the headlights. But generally this is it in its pretty much basic standard. And yeah, it is quite a nice looking model. But I think I'll save my thoughts for the final review after I've done a bit of extra work. I think I might be able to lift the standard of this model just a little bit further. In this second part of the build, I'm going to be adding some extra weathering, details, and even throwing it into a diorama. But before I can get into any of that, I actually need to protect the front windscreen from any of this work I might do. I actually have a Cricut machine and thought it would be a perfect opportunity to try out a homemade mask. Looking at pictures online, I cut a shape which looked like the kind of path that the windscreen wipers would leave on the windows. This was put into the Cricut software and cut out on some self-adhesive vinyl. I did cut it in a number of different sizes and selected the one that I thought looked the best. These were then peeled and stuck onto the front windscreen to act as masks. Moving into some weathering, I'm going to use this dirty down rust. This was painted on to a few select areas to try and give the impression that it's not a particularly well looked after vehicle. This is a really nice product, and when it dries it looks quite realistic, and it can be thinned and reactivated with water, so it could be turned into a thin wash if needed. After this, some dirty down moss would be used. I find it quite likely that a slightly neglected vehicle may collect moss in places which are not touched or disturbed for prolonged periods of time, such as on the roof. So I painted this into areas where I think moss might get the chance to grow. It's not too strong of an effect, and it just gives the impression that perhaps something is growing there. After this, I mixed up some K-Colors matte varnish and some light brown. This will make a very thin airbrush paint. This was airbrushed onto the lower surfaces of the vehicle, as well as the windows, which is why I added those masks earlier on. This should help build up the effect that this is a rather well used vehicle. I primarily focused this colour on the lower surfaces and edges of the vehicle. When that was dry, this sepia shade would be painted onto the wheels and the lower sides of the vehicle to further enhance the effect of this being a off-road vehicle. And because I didn't think that was quite enough, I've actually got some of this green stuff world mud texture. And this would be built up around the underframe of the vehicle and some of the exterior surfaces to give the impression that it has collected some mud as it's been driving through the countryside. Because I imagine the owner of this vehicle probably has struggled to see out the windows, I dipped a cotton bud in some isopropyl alcohol and then carefully rubbed away some of that matte brown airbrush paint I applied earlier to the windows. This should help give the impression that the owner has tried to clean these windows, perhaps by hand or with a dirty rag. The front windscreen mask though can simply be peeled away, and it should leave a fairly convincing effect, as though the windscreen wipers have actually been operational and cleaned the windows. Because I thought the flatbed looked a bit empty on this pickup truck, I added some 3D printed details. These details have all been suitably painted off screen, and they were added into the rear of the vehicle. I added things such as hay bales, toolboxes and spare fuel cans. This is a piece of white paper which I have softened with water and folded up to look like a tarpaulin. This was carefully pressed into place, and then it would be painted. I used an appropriate green colour for this one. And that's the vehicle pretty much done, and to a standard I'm happy with. So let's move on to a diorama base for it. I've got this MDF rectangle, which is a good size for a small scene. I glued on some packing foam which has been cut to different shapes to help build up the landscape. I then covered the entire diorama base with some household filler. This was pretty hands-on and I just manipulated the filler until I got the shape of the groundwork that I was happy with. I also have this 3D printed dry stone wall, which I pressed into place whilst the filler was still wet. And when that was all dry, I took it outside and gave it a black base coat with some spray paint. The next step was a bit more painting. I focused on the dry stone wall, building up a light grey over the top, as well as a few other areas of the scenery. After this, I then moved on to spraying on different shades of brown for the areas that should look like mud. In the more wet areas, I want to give the impression that this is perhaps a muddy and wet environment, so some areas would receive darker coats than others. When that was dry, I dry brushed different areas of the diorama base, using a light grey to help add some highlights. And then I moved on to adding some grass. Some static grass tufts were glued into various random places. This was then followed by thinning down some matte Mod Podge with water and brushing this over the scenery base. Various different scatter materials would then be applied to the surface, building up from a kind of crumbly foam, and then finishing with a static grass. After I'd done that, the excess would be carefully vacuumed away. Down one side of this diorama there is a little stream, and I built up layers of clear gloss varnish here to give the impression that there is a light trickle of water. I would also add some of this clear gloss varnish in other places to indicate that it has recently rained and there are puddles. I think all that this diorama really needs now is some figures. So I've got some figures from Scale 3D, which I think will be perfect for this. If you'd like to see how I painted these figures, check out the dedicated figure painting video I've made featuring these subjects. I'll link it in the description. So with everything now pretty much complete, I glued in place the Land Rover, and this was then followed by the farmer, his two companions, and a number of sheep on the other side of the wall. And with that, I'm calling my build of the Airfix Land Rover in 1/43 scale complete. And that's another build under the belt. I think I'll probably discuss the things that I didn't like so much about this kit to start with. First up, this is following the new format for starter sets from Airfix, and as a result there are no external frames to the plastic sprues. This does mean that they could suffer damage or parts become loose in the bag. It's a small concern, but fortunately in my example everything was fine. I understand why they do it, to save on plastic, but it does run the risk of damaging parts as they move around inside the box. As far as the fit of the kit goes, everything was up to the modern standard we expect from Airfix, apart from maybe that one small issue I had with the back of the cab being ever so slightly out of alignment. But as that's the only problem I had, it is very minor, and definitely something that can be overcome. Otherwise, the fit of the parts could be considered pretty flawless. The main problem I have with this kit are with the included paints. As I discussed, the paints in the older style bottles suffer from drying out. Although I was able to rescue some of them, I found the opacity of these paints was less than optimal. I would definitely be considering looking at getting my own paints, perhaps from a different manufacturer, if I were to do this kit again. It's definitely something that Airfix knows about, and I hope that in the future they will improve the paints that are included in their starter sets. Perhaps as a small suggestion as an improvement to Airfix would be the inclusion of a range of license plate numbers for this vehicle. There is only one included, so you get to build the one specific example shown here. But it would be nice to have a selection so that you could have a variety of different vehicles if you wanted them. I think this may encourage people to buy more than one example, particularly as this corresponds with O-gauge model railways here in the UK. It could lend itself to having multiple purchases for inclusion on a model railway. Perhaps in the future Airfix will consider releasing this in its own standalone boxing with a selection of license plate numbers and without those paints. I do keep a note of everything that I do inside of my modelling journals. These are books that I've created specifically to help you on the workbench. They just act as diaries, and you can keep a log of your builds inside of them. Check out Amazon if you'd like to get your hands on a copy. But in here I've logged that this build took me about 2 weeks to complete. I think the initial build of the kit though was fairly quick, and it was the figure painting and the diorama that took up the majority of the time. I'm pretty happy with my homemade masks, being something that I've not done before. But yeah, this is a project that I thoroughly enjoyed building, and I think with the extra weathering that I've done and the little scene helps to elevate it just a little bit more. Talking about this kit then, you would be looking at spending £14.99 at the time I was making this video, which for a starter set is pretty much in line with other kits in the range, especially given that this is pretty much a new tooling. It's a 2023 tooling, and this was the first release, so everything is pretty crisp. The low part count and the fit of the parts definitely means that this is perfect for a beginner. But of course the added complexity comes from those included paints, and I think that's probably where I would wrap this one up. It is a great kit to get started out with, but there is definitely room for improvement from the manufacturer side of things. Perhaps in the future we'll see another release of this kit, or perhaps a different variant of the Land Rover. As always, I'd like to give a quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them, check out the links in the description. There are other ways to help support the channel, and full information is below the video as well. The best way to support the video for free is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. But the last thing from me is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.